Now, as you might imagine, Jackson's presidency was an eventful presidency, and there are probably a number of things that we could touch upon, but we're going to deal with three. And by the way, all three of these intersect with the market revolution. Um, but to take them in order, uh, the first is the passage in 1830 of the Indian Removal Act. This was a congressional act that mandated the removal of what were called the five civilized tribes that were living in the American Southeast. And these five civilized tribes were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee or the Creek, and then the Seminoles. The Seminoles fought no fewer than three wars to oppose this removal, but the other four tribes went with varying degrees of acquiescence to the land that the United States government had set aside for them beyond the Mississippi River. And this was called the Indian Territory, what we know today as Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma. This forced displacement involved about 60,000 Native Americans between 1830 and 1850. The conditions in which they had to travel from their homelands to the Indian Territory were wretched. The U.S. Army that was supervising the movement, the preparations were just lousy, and so we estimate that between 10,000 and 17,000 Native Americans died on this journey from the American Southeast to the Indian Territory. Why did they die? They died of disease, especially cholera. They died of malnutrition. They died of fatigue. Some people were just too tired, to make the journey. They died of exposure to rain and cold. And we'll deal with the Indian removal in the future lecture, but that gives you an overview of it. The next thing to look at is something called the nullification crisis. And this occurs in 1832. And this actually involves President Andrew Jackson, squaring off against his own vice president, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And there's a very good video that I found online that describes the nullification crisis. And I'm gonna show that to you now.
In 1828, Congress passed a tariff to protect American manufacturers against cheaper foreign imports. This protective tariff almost brought the country to the brink of civil war.
The idea of a tariff is quite simple, really. It is a duty on a foreign good. Let's say the English blanket would cost $10. The Americans could only make it for $12. And so there's no way they could compete. Well, if you slap on a 50% tariff, suddenly that British blanket costs $15, the American blanket costs $12, and now you've helped out domestic manufacturing.
The tariff of 1828 appealed to manufacturers, and the heart of American manufacturing was in the North, in New England's growing textile industry. But Southerners hated the tariff. They called it the Tariff of Abominations.
Well, the South was not a manufacturer. The South exported goods and then had to import the manufactured goods. And so the South wanted low tariffs so they could buy these goods more cheaply.
The vice president at the time was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and he championed the fight against the tariff.
And in 1828, as vice president of the United States, but anonymously, John Calhoun writes what becomes known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And he says a couple of key things. Number one, the tariff is unconstitutional. And the reason that the tariff is unconstitutional in Calhoun's eyes is that it helps the North at the expense of the South. And here is where Calhoun, as a political theorist, really reveals some of his brilliance. He figures out a way that a state can constitutionally and legally nullify, void a federal law.
When Congress agreed to lower the tariff in 1832, The South Carolina contingent that wanted it eliminated was unsatisfied. It passed an ordinance of nullification, which declared the federal tariff did not exist within state boundaries.
The trump card for Calhoun, and what makes his theory of nullification that much more radical, is that he says, if a state does in fact determine that a law is unconstitutional, and they nullify that law, if the federal government attempts to force that law upon the state has the right to secede, to leave the Union.
President Andrew Jackson was furious. He railed against nullification and quietly began to prepare the Army for war. Behind closed doors, he told friends he would invade South Carolina and hang its leaders if the state did not back down. In 1833, Jackson got Congress to pass the Force Bill, authorizing him to use troops to enforce federal tariff laws if necessary. That same day, Senator Henry Clay engineered a compromise to gradually reduce the tariff enough to placate South Carolina. The bill squeaked through Congress, preventing a civil war. The South Carolina legislature met and withdrew its nullification of the tariff, but in a final act of defiance, abolished Jackson's Force Bill in their state.
Nullification as a theory never rears its head again. No one ever attempts to nullify a federal law again. But it does not kill the idea of secession. Secession continues to roll around, and as we know, there's an attempt to secede from the Union in 1861 by a number of southern states.
The third major event of Jackson's presidency is the one in which he was probably the most heavily invested. And this was something called the Bank War, which lasted for about 4 years. There had been a Bank of the United States that succeeded the first Bank of the United States that Alexander Hamilton had created. The second Bank of the United States had been created in 1816, chartered in 1816. Its president during Andrew Jackson's presidency was Nicholas Biddle, who was a sort of an elite Philadelphian member of the aristocracy, and somebody that that Jackson just didn't like on sight. But this Bank of the United States bothered him because its role essentially was to be a repository for federal revenue, for federal funds, and it would lend out these funds at interest. Jackson didn't like that, but the other part of it was there were a lot of state banks, and these state banks were, loaning money to people who wanted to buy land and who wanted to, build stores and manufacturing and do all this kind of economic activity, and these state banks tended to overdo it, to the point where, theoretically, the currency, and there was no national currency at this time, there's no legal tender. But so these bank notes were supposed to be backed by gold. But it didn't take too much brilliance to realize that these state banks were loaning out more banknotes than they could back with gold. What Biddle did was he bought up these state banknotes and held enough of them that he could threaten basically to turn them in and demand payment in gold. And this kept the state banks to some degree from just going ape and being irresponsible. Jackson didn't like any of this. There's another video that goes into this, and so I will let my excitement abate and let this next video do the work.
The biggest fight of Andrew Jackson's presidency was his battle against the Bank of the United States. In 1816, Congress had issued a charter creating the Second Bank of the United States. The bank's stockholders all came from the elite classes of the Northeast, and they were appointed, not elected.
The president of the bank was a Philadelphia aristocrat named Nicholas Biddle. And Jackson thought that Nicholas Biddle was operating the bank for the benefit of Nicholas Biddle and for his buddies.
Even Even though it was the sole repository for the federal government's deposits, the Bank of the United States remained a private institution. While paying out dividends to the government, it also made a profit for its stockholders.
They didn't just simply take the federal deposits and stick them away in a vault. They take those deposits and they loan them out. And they make money by loaning those deposits out. And so the bank is making very, very good money at this time period.
Jackson was the first American president to come from a poor background. Like many ordinary Americans, he hated the idea of a private bank run by a small number of wealthy stockholders.
Jackson wanted to get rid of it, and he said he was going to get rid of it. And whenever Jackson said he was going to do something, he usually ended up doing it, regardless of the opposition.
When the bank's charter came up for renewal in 1832, Jackson vetoed the bill, declaring that the bank was unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive of the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. With his re-election approaching, Jackson had staked his entire presidency on the issue of the bank.
And it was a triumph for Jackson. He was resoundingly re-elected. He was a very popular man. So the Bank of the United States knew that it was toast.
Once he was re-elected, Jackson took his revenge on the bank one step further. He decided to remove all of the federal government's deposits from the bank and place them in smaller local banks that he selected personally. His critics called them his pet banks.
In order to do that, he has to have the Secretary of the Treasury remove the deposits. The first Secretary of the Treasury he goes to, he says, I want you to remove the deposits. And this Secretary of the Treasury was a bank man and says, well, I'm sorry, President Jackson, I can't do that. He has this person moved to a different office. The second Secretary of the Treasury, a guy by the name of William Duane, comes into office. And Jackson says, well, Mr. Duane, I want you to remove the federal deposits. And Duane says, well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I can't do that. And he summarily fires Duane. The third Secretary of the Treasury is Roger Taney, who's moved over from the Attorney General position. And Jackson says, Mr. Taney, I want you to remove the federal deposits. And Taney says, well, yes, Mr. President, I'm happy to remove those federal deposits. And now Taney wins as a result of doing this. He ultimately becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when John Marshall passes away.
Jackson's enemies in the Senate were so infuriated by what they considered Jackson's expansions of presidential power that they formed a new opposition party known as the Whigs. And with the death of the Bank of the United States came the end of an era of centralized control over America's monetary system. The following decades would be a time of laissez-faire as economic power moved away from the federal government and towards private businesses.